Today is no coding, just vibes. We were feeling the vibe, we were moving with it. Feel free to interject at any moment with questions. I have it slated for the end, and we'll try to get through this. But sometimes we have those burning questions that we must get to, and I'm okay with that. So, on that note, our brief agenda for today is I have a tiny overview and terminology section talking about vibe coding and the process that we follow for it, effectively using vibe coding, and then we're going to talk about how we go from vibe coding to vibe TSM. And then I have some examples and use cases where I've been able to use this or find it effective as we went on. So, what does this mean? The context around this is that we have chatbots, ChatGPT, AI, LLM. We'll use these interchangeably in this presentation because they are the same thing. So if I use them, I'm not specifically calling them out to be a different thing. Just know that when we're talking here, we are talking all of the things that people are referring to as AI. We mean that for this. So our best buddy, our best pal Google defines vibe coding for us in a very technical way. So vibe coding is an emerging software development practice that uses artificial intelligence to generate functional code from natural language prompts, accelerating development and making app building more accessible, especially to those with limited programming experience. I love that. But this is how I would say we use language and AI magic to generate stuff. The stuff is the important part because that's what we're doing here. That's all we do all day in our jobs is we do stuff. So we take the language and we make more stuff. You are being measured in your level of productivity by the amount of stuff that you make. So why not use the language that we all use to make that stuff? So when we think about the vibe coding process, it is a kind of familiar one for those of you who have dabbled in design thinking, but we describe what we want. We use our magical AI buddy to generate it. We can then validate it, and then we refine it. We keep that loop going forever and ever and ever and ever and ever until we are satisfied or satiated and we feel like we're doing what we're doing. So one of the questions that you have is, where do I vibe code? And there are many answers to that. There is no wrong answer, but as you think about it, the most popular one is going to be inside of a conversational UI. And when I say that, I mean Copilot, Gemini, ChatGPT, those types of UIs where you're having a chat with some sort of AI bot. With actual vibe coding, there are specific versions of those that are implemented within coding programs like VS Code, or even more specialized software there. There's also some other things that are being rolled out that are very specialized just for this purpose. And there's a lot of companies that will sell you a lot of things. And in those cases, some of them might be great, but you don't really need anything specialized in order to, do the vibe coding or the vibe TSM. For the most part, you can get by just using some sort of conversational UI, especially once it starts to come to vibe TSM. You wouldn't really be doing this one inside of like your coding window, like a VS Code. You could, it just might not be as effective for you. So if we take this process that I've put out here and we say, like, what does that look like? You give it an initial prompt. So that's what we have over here. I'm going to tell you now this is a terrible prompt. If you do this, you would not end up with a great result. But one of the great things is there is no real failure or wrong way to do it. There's just, better ways to do it. So we would say create an app that allows the user to make a list of to-dos and mark them as completed. It's going to spit out some code. So one of the pitfalls you're going to see here is I didn't tell it what language or where to do it or anything like that. Do I want this in JavaScript or Ruby or C++ or any of those things? So it's going to do what it's going to do. And then you would run that code and then you would refine it. So you should say things like, oh, completed item should move to the bottom of the list. That's something we didn't put in our initial prompt, and we refine it by adding that new capability. The UI should use Bootstrap instead of Material UI because, oops, we didn't specify that and it spit out this thing that I'm not familiar with. We should say, oops, yeah, I really meant you to use this in React. And then we say, no, the current version of React. We say, no, React 20, not 16. So that's a little joke there because one of the things that you're going to see as a pitfall is sometimes these models are trained on older things. So you have to be careful with your use of things like current version because it might not know what current version is. So again, another joke here is sometimes they just don't listen to you. So you'll have to say the same thing about a dozen times. But that's the process. You iterate, you refine, you validate, and you just keep moving along with it. So as we think about that, what does effectively using it look like? The biggest thing to take away is define explicit requirements up front, but don't get too wordy with it. So as you're thinking about rolling out practices using chat, AI, things like that, you want to make sure you give it all of the things that are kind of in your head floating around or things that you know. Um, and that includes, if you're thinking from the vibe coding perspective, specific technology, the stacks of technology, which versions of those, different software that it interacts with, if you're using any libraries or design systems or things like that. You want to let it know what you want the program to do. And then to a limited amount, you kind of also want to let it know what you don't want it to do. You don't need to do everything. Like you don't need to say, make me my to-do list app, and it shouldn't hold recipes. It doesn't need to know that level of not doing. But if you don't want your to-do list to do certain things, like don't cross out to-dos once they're marked because I want to be able to still read them. That would be a good requirement to have there. A lot of this comes down to similar requirements that you would have in good software design if you're limiting or rolling out software development lifecycle. And then you also want to make sure that you're defining any workflows, processes, interactions, business cases, business processes, any of that type of stuff you can put in those prompts too. Again, you don't want it to be, 10,000 words about what you want the software to do. The point is to have it be a little bit iterative as you go along. But knowing what you know and putting it out there will be helpful. So thinking about that, as you're doing this process, it's going to get so much stuff wrong. But don't be hurt by it. Don't take it personally. One of the cool things about the AI and the chat is you can just say, no, do it this way. And it's going to say, you're absolutely right, exclamation mark. And then it's going to give you the exact code. It's what it does and it's fine. And sometimes it'll do it wrong again. It will keep doing it wrong over and over again. And that's a true delight. Sometimes it will also gaslight you, which is also a delight where it goes, I am using the latest version of this. And you're like, I don't believe you are. Um, I've had cases where I've given it exact links as context for documents and it's supposed to read it. And it says, here, I've updated it to follow the documentation. And then it doesn't. So you'll see things like that happen. Um, it's very susceptible to things like hallucinations where it will write things that look very real. It will even hallucinate features or things that should work where you're like, that would be a really cool thing if it worked that way, but it doesn't. So the advice there is to kind of validate as you go, verify, rerun things, and kind of check. If we were actually all programmers here and we wanted to follow that, we would have, full unit test and test-driven development, and we would know immediately, but we're vibe coding right now. Testing is for people who make money. So I said it earlier, I mentioned the term context. That wasn't in our definitions, but one of the things that a lot of these apps will do is they'll allow you to tag certain things or add certain documents. When you think about your UI programs like ChatGPT or Copilot, the context there is when you add a document or you add a link to a Confluence or you add an image or you add something. Context there is the entire message you've sent as well as specific links to things. When you think about it inside of your coding programs, you can provide very specific context. So you can say this exact JavaScript file, this HTML file, this database, or lines 100 through 120. So that can be really helpful when you're talking about something and you want to iterate on it. So rather than saying, look at all of the things that I could have ever given you and fix them, you say, this section is wrong. And that can be really helpful when you're trying to iterate. So we've talked about vibe code, but we're not really here for coding, especially as we think about our service management practices and things like that. As we're rolling those out, that's not really what we're looking for here. So what do we do to get to Vibtsm? It's the same process. That's the spoiler for you. So Vibtsm is just a term where we're talking about using AI to help us roll out complex ITSM processes. It can be any aspect of it from the technical implementation side to the high level workflows. There's a lot of different ways that you can go ahead and leverage those in order to do it. So you describe, generate, validate, refine. It's a good framework to use here as you're rolling it out, because when you think about this, you could say something like create an SOP for incident response for a new call center process. As we learned previously, this would probably be a terrible prompt because we didn't give it any details about why this is new or what that means. But it's going to generate an artifact for us. So rather than generating code, we're generating artifacts. I'm going to say artifact. That usually means document, workflow, something like that. And your validate step here isn't running it. I guess you could simulate, but in reality, you're just going to read through and see, is that what I got? Is that what I want? And then account for follow the sun, consider escalations, or as I said here, make your own edits. That's one way you could handle that too. This is something you could do in the coding world too, but if you're vibe coding, you're probably not going into too much doing your own edits. Um, but in the Vibe TSM space, sometimes we just want to make a change. It wouldn't make sense to like edit point number 2 to say this when we could just go in and click or clack and make it do it too. So from the Vibe TSM best practices space, think about specific artifacts and outcomes. What I mean by that is don't just say like, create my ITSM for my company. It's not gonna do that. It might try. It might give you a good high level strategy. But you really want to think about on a per document level or a per process level, you say, create the workflow for this, create this document I'm trying to do, create my SLA, create my whatever that might be. And then you can use it as a supplement to the processes that you have ongoing. So let's say you're in the middle of a huge change management revamp. You're rolling out a new process and you're coming up with the different forms and workflows. You can use it there and say, here's what we have so far. I need to add this. It's really good at doing that if you provide it that starting point that you already have. Instead of saying things like which technology stacks are you looking for, it's important to say we follow ITIL, we follow ISO, we follow these different standards, which versions or which parts of those processes you're looking for. It will be pretty good about holding to that if you give it that context there. When you're thinking about what you can use it for, it doesn't have to just be processes. It doesn't have to just be a workflow or, an entry in a wiki. It's really great at coming up with templates, or it's good at coming up with, what elements of a form do I need? Because it's built on, the internet and, all of the knowledge of mankind that they've input into some of these systems, you can go there and say, like, what elements does a successful change management form have on it? And it will give you, a bulleted list of all of those. And it might even give you some tips and say, like, don't do this, do this. You don't have to then just print that and say, here's our change management process, but it's amazing as a starting point. I mentioned templates here as well, too, because you might be sending out an email, transactional email with every change log that says, change log blah, blah, blah was entered at this time. It contains the following stuff. You don't have to make that. Let something like this generate that for you, and it's going to make a really good email template for you. The other way is consider it to be one of those paid consultants that Matt mentioned earlier. Tell it that it's a paid consultant. Say, you are a consultant for one of the big four. You make millions of dollars. I find it helps if you say that part. It likes to know that it's being paid well. Oh, we have a question from John.
Yeah, so this is trained. So this would be trained like a ChatGPT would be trained.
So this isn't about rolling your own system. This is about leveraging those systems that are out there. If you wanted to roll your own system and you had that technical know-how or some internal tooling like that, that would be totally okay too. One of the pitfalls of using these systems is you want to be careful not to put proprietary data in there, so that a lot of companies do roll out their own. But this isn't talking about implementing a specific solution. This is about
But
using the existing tooling for your own means.
but if you wanted it to operate within the boundaries of a framework or a practice, you could train it to do that.
They generally already are, in my experience. So
Okay.
if you tell it you want to follow ITIL v3 because v4 just hasn't, resonated with you, it will do that. You say,
Okay.
generate a change management process in line with ITIL v3. I hate change enablement. I want to manage my change.
Yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
will go
Okay.
ahead and know what that means.
Okay.
Because generally they're trained on everything that has ever been on the internet, as well as a lot of things that it's illegally downloaded. There's lawsuits. That's not my care. I'm just a user.
Okay.
But the more
Thank you.
litigious amongst us can definitely figure that out. And that's where it's helpful to use it as a consultant because it does have access to just, all of the domain knowledge you could ever have. Um, and then one of the areas where that can be helpful is a lot of these companies will publish processes, things like that, documentation, thousands upon thousands of pages that you might never find, even if you were trying to. I go to Microsoft as my example, is they have so much knowledge out there, and it's in different places, in different forums, and different things, that if you tried to find it, you might not ever get to it. They put out white papers as PDFs that you might not find because you're not clicking every link. But ChatGPT tends to have that type of context. And again, ChatGPT being broad, AI tends to have that context there. So one of the things I've found helpful is you say, like, what does company X do for their SLAs? And it will spit it out for you. Um, you can then usually validate it. You can ask it for links now, and it's pretty accurate about that. There was a time where it was making up links, but for the most part, these languages will give you actual citations that are real. And that's been really effective for me, where you say, like, if we're rolling out this process, what is the state of the art, or what are other people publishing as their process? That way, you're not just inventing what you think should work, but you're able to get out there and say, this is what is working. So I want to talk about some examples and use cases of how you might be able to use this. Um, at a high level, if you have something that you're trying to roll out, so let's say you haven't really had service level agreements, you know it's something you want, and you want to have things like uptime, availability, all of these different areas that you know you should have, but you've never really had a chance to implement. So you can use something like this to say generate an SLA for a specific service, and it will plop out a pretty effective document for you that will have things like which metrics it's tracking, how they're measured. You can even iterate with it and say, I want the algebraic formulas for this, and it will put it out in like math texts, and you can have a really fancy formula where people go, wow, that guy is smart. So I found that stuff very effective because people do end up wanting that. And when it spits out like KPIs, you can even ask it, like, how will we measure that? Which things will we need to put as inputs for this? And it will suggest a lot of that too. The other area that this type of thing is great is a lot of these SLAs will start with like a big section up top that is like, here's our definitions and terminologies, because it's kind of like a contract. Um, and it will spit those things out for you so that you don't have to write them every time. Where I find its strengths are for this type of thing is that it's very quick to iterate. If you don't like something, you just say, I don't like it, and it will change it. It creates a very good starting point to have these informed discussions. You can bring them to a team as that starting point. And then where I found it very effective is when you have multiple versions. So what I mean by that is sometimes you have this dream future state that you know is 2 to 5 years off, but you know that you're doing a pilot or a beta in the short term. Where that can be really effective for you is you say, here's this huge vision that we've developed, but how do we use that now? You can say, I need to pare this down for a beta where we're rolling this out to one team or one group within our organization. How can we best use that? It's also really great because it can pull in those other standards. Or if you input things like an existing SLA that you have for another service, you can say, take this SLA and generate it for this, 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 and this. Some of my complaints, I will say, that I found with this type of thing is it starts off too wordy 100% of the time. Um, so you can head that off by putting it into your prompt to say, like, be concise, be technical, or write it based on the average person reading it. It will always insert non-relevant info. And that's how you sometimes get caught. People say, oh, I see that you use ChatGPT because it will randomly put a prompt like, I see that you enjoy writing SLAs. Would you like me to generate a longer one for you? And you're like, no. Um, it does not necessarily know your company specific jargon or processes unless you're using something like retrieval augmented generation or inserting your own things. There are tools out there where you can give it access to, all of your SharePoints and Confluence and wikis and things like that. But for the most part, a lot of us aren't at that maturity point, I would wager. And then the other thing is it does like to lie. So you do have to make sure that you're proofreading. You don't want to just generate this, then publish it and go, that is it. We did it 100%. You need to just make sure. And when I say it lies for something in SLA, it will say, uptime is calculated based on 102%. And you're like, is it? What is 102% uptime? It means that we actually give you a bonus server once in a while. I don't know. So you have to make sure that you're catching some of those things and you're not just letting it do there. But the way that I say to best think about that is think about anything that it does there as variables. You can even ask it to do that. Say, whenever you give me a number, bold it or put it in red so that I can see it. Just think about it as like a Mad Lib. You're filling in the blank with the right things eventually, but it gives you that starting point. Because if it generates and says that your uptime guarantee is 99.998, is it? Can you effectively do that? Is that something that you can be beholden to? Do you have the resources to keep to that? Or are you more of like a 95%? or it might generate something based on a best practice that isn't true at your company. So you might say we have 100% uptime because we have redundancy in place, but it's not true. Your company has maintenance windows and you are allowed an outage every Friday at 4 p.m. or something like that. So if that's the case, you don't have 100% uptime. You want to make sure that what it's generating matches for your company, so you'll want to go in there and fix those things. A second use case I found is really helpful is when you want to kind of throw things back and forth with it. When you're generating a new process, it's super cool to talk to it and iterate with the chat and say, I'm rolling out this new process. I need it to do these things. I need to do this. What does that look like? What does an escalation look like? What are the criteria for an escalation? It's great because it will define the roles, the goals for everyone, and then you can iterate off of that. And it's super easy to make those changes. It's gone through this fascination with generating mermaid charts lately, which I'm not sure if everyone's familiar, but it's basically a text version of a process map. I don't know why. Somebody must have stock in mermaid charts. But in my experience, when I put them into a mermaid chart renderer, you end up with this like spaghetti, like quite literal spaghetti, where there's 1,000 arrows coming off of one thing and it's not really a process map. So maybe I'm using it wrong, but I'm more apt to believe that it's just generating those because it was told to. So in those types of cases, you might need to manually do some things, but it still can be really great when it does create that for you. One thing that I have found with processes is that it's not very human, because it is not human. So what I mean by that is it will say like, yes, we have followed this on support. Matt will be on call from 8 a.m. until 8 a.m. the next day. And that is a beautiful process where you say one person is on call for an entire day. But sleep is also very important. So sometimes it doesn't count for the human factor there, which is where we come in. We are the human factor of this. You need to call it out on those things, and you need to make sure that you give it that type of thing or make those edits yourself. And again, it will miss your company domain specific information because it doesn't have it necessarily. So if you are not a follow this on organization and it's generating that, do you need to be? If you only operate in one time zone, maybe not. Or you could if you really want to provide that excellent level of support. So one of the areas that we forget is that we do have some more technical things we can be doing. So while it's not coding, this is like the most code-like thing that we do in our space, is within our IT service management systems, we're generally adding new fields, forms, inputs, things like that. A use case that I have described here is sometimes we're rolling out something like a CMDB. Even if you have all of your certifications and you're the most erudite, up-to-date, well-read person on these topics, it can be really tricky to track what goes into these things. Like, do I need these? What should go into it? What is a good starting point? You can say, what fields go into a CMDB? And then it will give you a very good explanation. It'll say, well, here's the different types of records you would have there. Here's what we found, because it's using examples from all of the marketing material across every service management vendor. So that's pretty cool stuff to have access to, and you don't have to go and read that. So you can say, okay, here's what we need, and then it will generate that list for you. It'll create a beautiful table for you, and you can ask it for any columns you need, and it will generate them quickly. So if you give it a prompt like this, it'll create that structured data. And let's say it starts off with just the fields and the data types. So it'll say that we need a, host name, CMDB ID, and it will tell you what those types are. And you say, well, actually, all of these things also need a description. So generate those. And it will go ploop, and it will generate all those. And that's the real value, I think, here, because those are the things that we all could do, but it's not necessarily worth our time to do. Something like a description of a field is valuable, but do you want to be the one who's manually writing it for everything? If you love doc writing, that might be something you have time for. But a lot of the time, if you're thinking about that, or like help text that goes below each field, it's very generic and it's almost, something that we can generate on the fly, and this will do that for you. Sometimes it still struggles from that can be a bit too detailed. It's going to create a very complex system when sometimes you only need, 4 fields. And it won't create it specific to your organization necessarily. So you still need to use some of those best practices even if you were doing this yourself. So it's, do I need this type of data? Do I need to report on this? Why am I collecting this? Don't have these fields just because it tells you to. So you need an editorial eye as you're using this. But it's super useful for getting some of that stuff out there in a, usable format. And at least as a starting point, it can be great. With that in mind, one of the areas I think a lot of us do use this is for things like using emails, messages, templates. I find it super helpful when I know what I need to write, but I just don't know how to say it. Um, a recent change that I made to one of our data systems that we have required me to send messages to a broader group that was just saying, like, here's a heads up, this is coming, as well as to a technical group of people who integrated with this as a data stream, and they had reports and dashboards and all of that type of stuff running off of it. So that's a case where I could write this multiple audience email. I could write the follow-up emails and things like that. But you can say, I need to write an email to these audiences, as well as a follow-up email that I'll be sending a week later, as well as a final email the week before our deadline. And you provide it that information and say what the changes are at a very basic level, and it will write the actual email. And you can give it prompts like use emoji or make it readable or bold things so that people will read them, make it scannable, and it will iterate and make those for you. It's really effective because you can change the tone for these different audiences. For the technical users, we wanted to make sure that they have the exact specifics of what's going to be changing for their implementations. But for the broader audiences, you don't want to go too inside baseball, because what does that mean to them? They don't need to know the exact technical changes that are happening. They just need to know that the change is happening. One of the things that is just a constant with these large language models is they love to be very flowery with their language. They will be very circuitous and roundabout for how they say something, which can be fine, but I find it impacts readability. You can prompt them to be not too flowery, but then I find they go to the other direction where they'll be very curt, like that $1 million executive. And they like to use some of those phrases that only AI uses, like delve. Um, and that can be okay, but it also does signal to people that you have done this. One of the things, as an example, is we love to post to our internal Yammer, Viva, Engage, whatever you call it, business social media. And there's like this formula to it where it starts off with like a single emoji, then a bold headline, and then a bulleted list with 3 items that all have emojis as the first thing. You're like, it starts to be too formulaic, and then people don't read it because your goal was to make it readable, but now you're using the same exact thing for everything. So you do have to be careful of that type of thing. So with that, it's time for some Q and Slay.